"Ma'am, I'm really sorry about this, but the HOA president called it in personally." The irony was so thick you could cut it with a butter knife. There I stood, barefoot on my own driveway, watching my employee, Tommy Martinez, apologetically hook my BMW onto the flatbed of my own tow truck. The morning air bit at my skin through my thin bathrobe, but the chill I felt had nothing to do with the October weather. This was war, declared at dawn by a woman who had no idea she'd just handed me the keys to her destruction. The certified letter in my trembling hand bore yesterday's date and Veronica Ashworth's signature, a death warrant she'd signed for her own reign of suburban tyranny. You're about to hear the story of how an HOA president's obsession with control became her undoing, and how sometimes the best revenge is simply letting someone dig their own grave deep enough to bury themselves alive. The chain of events that led to this moment began 3 months earlier, when I made the fatal mistake of parking my car in my own driveway. I know how that sounds, but in Willowbrook Estates, under Veronica's iron-fisted interpretation of our community covenants, even the most basic property rights were subject to her approval. My BMW 540i, a sleek charcoal gray sedan that I'd saved 2 years to buy, apparently violated Section 12.4 of our HOA guidelines regarding vehicle aesthetics and neighborhood harmony. According to Veronica's increasingly creative interpretations, the car's factory chrome trim constituted excessive ornamentation, and its low-profile tires were deemed incompatible with the family-friendly atmosphere of our community. The first violation notice arrived on a Tuesday, hand-delivered by Veronica herself in a performance that drew half the neighborhood to their windows. She marched up my walkway like a general inspecting troops, her sensible flats clicking against the concrete with military precision. Her silver hair was pulled into a bun so tight it looked painful, and her clipboard, that damned clipboard, was clutched against her chest like a shield. The woman dressed like she was perpetually attending a funeral, all black pantsuits and stern expressions, as if the very act of suburban living required mourning attire. "Mr. Rodriguez," she announced loud enough for the entire street to hear, "your vehicle is in violation of multiple community standards. You have 72 hours to remedy the situation or face escalating penalties." The citation she thrust into my hands looked official enough to fool a federal judge, complete with letterhead, case numbers, and a breakdown of fines that started at $50 and escalated to vehicle impoundment. What she didn't mention was that nowhere in our actual HOA bylaws, the ones we'd all signed when purchasing our homes, was there any reference to chrome trim or tire specifications. But Veronica had learned long ago that most residents wouldn't bother reading the fine print. They'd pay the fine, modify their property, or in extreme cases, simply move away rather than challenge her authority. She had perfected the art of bureaucratic intimidation, wielding Robert's Rules of Order like a weapon and burying opposition under mountains of procedural technicalities. The previous year alone, she'd forced the Hendersons to repaint their house because the shade of beige was too adventurous, made the Kowalskis remove their mailbox for being unnecessarily decorative, and banned the Chen family's garden gnomes for promoting kitsch culture inconsistent with our community values. Standing in my kitchen that Tuesday evening, studying the violation notice under the harsh fluorescent light, I felt the familiar burn of injustice that every HOA victim knows. The document was a masterpiece of official-sounding nonsense, referencing subsections that didn't exist and penalties that had no basis in her actual governing documents. But here's what Veronica didn't know about Marcus Rodriguez, mild-mannered software consultant of 47 Maple Grove Drive. I owned 3 businesses, including Rodriguez Recovery Services, the largest independent towing company in the county. You see, while my neighbors knew me as the quiet guy who worked from home and kept his lawn immaculately manicured, my real empire existed 20 miles away in an industrial district most Willowbrook residents had never seen. Rodriguez Recovery operated a fleet of 17 tow trucks, handled contracts for half the parking lots in the city, and yes, provided towing services for several HOAs in the area, including, as fate would have it, Willowbrook Estates. The contract had been signed 2 years earlier, back when I was just another resident, and the previous board president was a reasonable man named Jim Patterson. The paperwork sat in my office files under the business name, and apparently none of Veronica's people had bothered to cross-reference the ownership records. When she needed cars towed, she simply called the number on the existing contract, completely unaware that every dollar in penalties she collected through impoundment services was flowing directly into my bank account. 3 weeks after that first violation notice, I received a second one, then a third. Each citation grew more creative in its accusations, more threatening in its language. My car's aggressive styling was supposedly intimidating to children. The tinted windows were inconsistent with community transparency values. At one point, she claimed the BMW's keyless entry system was promoting technological inequality among residents with older vehicles. But the morning everything changed, that cold October dawn, when Tommy's truck pulled into my driveway, I realized Veronica had finally overplayed her card. The certified letter that had arrived the previous evening was different from the others. This wasn't a violation notice or a fine. This was a direct action, signed by the board president herself, authorizing immediate vehicle removal under the Emergency Powers Clause of the HOA covenant. Emergency powers, it turned out, was Veronica's latest invention. Buried in a recent newsletter that most residents had thrown away unread was an announcement about enhanced enforcement capabilities to address urgent covenant violations that pose immediate risks to community standards. The language was deliberately vague, designed to sound official without actually meaning anything, but it gave Veronica the justification she needed to escalate from fines to seizures. Tommy finished securing the chains around my BMW's wheels, his movements efficient and professional, despite the awkwardness of the situation. He'd worked for me for 3 years since getting out of the Army, and I trusted him completely. But right now, he was just following protocol, responding to what appeared to be a legitimate towing request from an authorized HOA representative. "The truck's going to be at the east side impound lot," he said quietly, avoiding eye contact with the neighbors who were now openly gawking from their porches. "The standard fee is $350 for the tow, plus $50 a day storage. The lady said to tell you that payment plans are available if you want to discuss compliance modifications." Compliance modifications. Even in my growing fury, I had to admire Veronica's complete commitment to bureaucratic doublespeak. She couldn't just say surrender. She had to dress it up in committee speak and pretend this was all about community standards rather than her pathological need to control every aspect of her neighbors' lives. As Tommy's truck pulled away, with my BMW secured to the flatbed, I felt something shift inside me. The cold morning air no longer seemed like an inconvenience. It felt clarifying, focusing. Veronica Ashworth had just made the biggest tactical error of her dictatorial career. She'd declared war on the one person in Willowbrook Estates who had the resources, knowledge, and motivation to fight back. But more than that, she'd handed me the perfect weapon to destroy her own playbook. Every illegal towing fee, every fabricated violation, every abuse of power would now flow directly through my business. I wouldn't have to investigate her corruption. I'd be collecting evidence of it every day. You know that feeling when you realize someone has underestimated you so completely that their mistake becomes your victory? That's exactly what washed over me as I stood in my driveway watching my own tow truck disappear around the corner. Veronica thought she was teaching me a lesson about respecting authority. What she had actually done was give me front-row seats to her entire operation. The war for Willowbrook Estates was about to begin, and Veronica had no idea her enemy was already inside the castle walls.
Motion carries. Vehicle impoundment authority is hereby granted to the board president for immediate implementation. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry wasps as Veronica's gavel struck the folding table one final time, sealing my fate with the theatrical flair of a medieval executioner. The Willowbrook Estates Community Center had been transformed into her personal courtroom, complete with a projection screen displaying forensic-level photographs of my BMW that would have made CSI investigators proud. 23 residents sat in uncomfortable metal chairs, most scrolling their phones or checking their watches, completely unaware they were witnessing the birth of suburban fascism. But I was paying attention. I was taking notes. Because what unfolded over the next 90 minutes wasn't just an HOA meeting. It was a masterclass in how unchecked power corrupts absolutely, and I had a front-row seat to document every illegal maneuver. The meeting had been called with exactly 72 hours' notice, the minimum required by state HOA laws, posted on a Tuesday evening when most residents were dealing with dinner and homework. Veronica knew her audience. The people who showed up were either her loyal supporters or, like me, residents who'd received certified letters demanding their attendance. The room smelled of industrial carpet and burned coffee from the ancient machine in the corner, creating an atmosphere more suited to a parole hearing than a community discussion. "Ladies and gentlemen," Veronica began, clicking to the first slide of her presentation with the confidence of a prosecutor delivering opening statements, "we gathered tonight to address a growing crisis that threatens the very fabric of our community." The screen filled with a blown-up photograph of my BMW taken from her bedroom window. I could tell from the angle and the reflection of her lace curtains in the image. She'd been conducting surveillance operations from her house at 52 Maple Grove, directly across the street from mine, documenting every detail of my vehicle with the dedication of a private investigator. The presentation was titled "Preserving Property Values Through Enhanced Vehicle Standards," and it was clear Veronica had spent considerable time crafting what amounted to a legal brief against my right to park in my own driveway. Slide after slide displayed close-up photographs of my chrome trim, each image annotated with measurements and arrows pointing to what she termed excessive reflective surfaces. She'd somehow obtained the manufacturer's specifications for my tires, comparing the sidewall height to what she claimed was the community standard, a measurement that appeared to exist nowhere in our actual HOA documents. "As you can see," she continued, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd never been challenged, "this vehicle represents a clear violation of Section 8.2.4 regarding automotive aesthetics." She clicked to a slide showing the relevant bylaw. But here's where things got interesting. The bylaw she quoted existed, but it was a general statement about maintaining vehicles in good working order and appearance consistent with community standards. There was no mention of chrome trim, tire specifications, or any of the 14 violations she'd supposedly documented. Board member Janet Kowalski, a nervous woman in her 70s who treated Veronica like an infallible deity, raised her hand tentatively. "The measurements are very thorough, Veronica, very professional." The other board members murmured their agreement like a Greek chorus, their devotion to Veronica's leadership both pathetic and terrifying to witness. But it was board member David Chen who asked the question that revealed the true scope of Veronica's ambitions. "This seems like a lot of work for one vehicle violation. Are we planning to apply these standards to other residences' cars as well?" Veronica's smile was the kind you see on nature documentaries right before a predator strikes. "I'm so glad you asked, David. That brings us to tonight's primary agenda item, the Vehicle Standards Initiative." She clicked to a new slide, revealing a policy document that must have been 20 pages long, complete with appendices, measurement charts, and an enforcement timeline that would make a military operation jealous. The initiative was breathtaking in its scope and audacity. It granted the HOA president unilateral authority to determine whether any resident's vehicle met community aesthetic standards. It established a point-based violation system that could lead to immediate towing for what amounted to subjective design preferences. Most incredibly, it created a Vehicle Aesthetics Committee, consisting solely of the board president, with the power to conduct proactive compliance inspections of every car, truck, and motorcycle in the neighborhood. The authority to remove non-compliant vehicles immediately, she explained, is essential for maintaining our property values. We cannot allow individual residents to diminish the investment of their neighbors through poor automotive choices. The way she said automotive choices made it sound like a moral failing, a character defect that required intervention from higher authorities. You need to understand something about HOA law that most residents don't know. Boards can only enforce rules that actually exist in the governing documents. They can't create new restrictions through meeting motions or policy initiatives without following specific amendment procedures that require homeowner votes and legal review. But Veronica was counting on the fact that 90% of residents had never read the covenants beyond the first page, and the other 10% were too intimidated by her bureaucratic theater to challenge her authority. Mrs. Henderson, an 80-year-old retired teacher who lived next door to me, stood up slowly during the public comment period. "Excuse me, Veronica, but I don't see how this young man's car is bothering anyone. It's always clean, and he parks it properly in his own driveway." Her voice shook slightly, but she pressed on. "My late husband always said a man's driveway is his castle, and I don't think we should be telling people what kind of car they can drive." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Veronica's expression shifted from practiced politeness to something much darker, and when she spoke, her voice carried the authority that probably terrorized subordinates throughout her corporate career. "Mrs. Henderson, I appreciate your perspective, but property values are everyone's concern. When one resident's choices affect the entire community, individual preferences must yield to collective good." "But whose definition of collective good?" Mrs. Henderson asked, and I wanted to stand up and applaud her courage. "Who decided that this nice young man's car was a problem? I didn't get a survey. Did anyone else?" Veronica's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but she maintained her composure with the skill of someone who'd spent decades managing corporate boardrooms. "The board has conducted extensive research into property value preservation strategies, Mrs. Henderson. Our decisions are based on objective data, not personal preferences." She gestured toward her presentation as if it were peer-reviewed scientific research rather than a collection of photographs taken from her bedroom window. The vote, when it finally came, was a formality. Janet Kowalski, David Chen, and Treasurer Bob Martinez raised their hands in unanimous support of the Vehicle Standards Initiative. The motion carried with the efficiency of a Stalin-era show trial, complete with manufactured evidence and predetermined outcomes. As the meeting concluded and residents filed out into the parking lot, I lingered near the refreshment table, observing the aftermath of Veronica's victory. She stood near the exit, accepting congratulations from her supporters with the gracious smile of a politician who'd just secured another term. But I noticed something else. She was taking notes in a small leather portfolio, documenting which residents had spoken against her proposal and who had remained silent. "Quite a presentation tonight," I said, approaching her with what I hoped looked like grudging admiration. "You clearly put a lot of work into those measurements." She narrowed her eyes slightly, trying to read my tone. "Community standards don't maintain themselves, Mr. Rodriguez. Some of us take our responsibilities seriously." "Oh, I take my responsibilities very seriously," I replied, meeting her gaze directly. "More seriously than you might imagine." Something flickered across her expression, maybe uncertainty or the first hint that her victory might not be as complete as she thought. But then her mask of professional authority slipped back into place, and she turned to speak with Janet Kowalski about implementation timelines and enforcement protocols. Walking to my car that evening, the same BMW that would be gone from my driveway within a week, I felt the strange calm that comes with absolute clarity. Veronica had just shown me exactly who she was and how she operated. She'd revealed the full extent of her ambitions and the methods she used to crush opposition. Most importantly, she'd created a legal framework that would serve my purposes far better than it would serve hers. Because here's what Veronica didn't know about the Vehicle Standards Initiative she just rammed through her compliant board. Every single towing authorization would now flow through Rodriguez Recovery Services. Every fabricated violation, every abuse of her newly granted powers would generate a paper trail that led directly to my office. She just created the perfect system to document her own corruption.
The fake security camera rotated with a mechanical whir that could be heard 3 houses away. I pressed myself deeper into the shadows behind Mrs. Henderson's prize-winning roses, their thorns catching on my dark hoodie as I adjusted the night vision binoculars for a clearer view. The October air was sharp enough to make my breath visible, but the adrenaline coursing through my veins kept me warm as I watched Veronica's house like a private investigator on a stakeout. Her motion-activated floodlight swept across the manicured lawn in predictable 37-second intervals, creating pockets of darkness that a careful observer could exploit. This wasn't just reconnaissance, this was intelligence gathering for what would become the most satisfying takedown in HOA history. You're probably wondering what drove a respectable software consultant to crouch in rose bushes at midnight. But sometimes understanding your enemy requires getting uncomfortably close to their operation. The decision to conduct surveillance had crystallized 3 days after the community center meeting, when I'd spent an afternoon diving deep into public records about Veronica's house. What I discovered would have shocked most residents of Willowbrook Estates. The woman who spent her days terrorizing neighbors over minor violations was living in a house that violated more municipal codes than a crack den. Her fortress of security was built on a foundation of lies, forgeries, and enough permit violations to keep a city inspector busy for months. Veronica's house at 52 Maple Grove had been purchased 18 months earlier, and the public records showed a fascinating pattern of improvements that had never been properly permitted. The elaborate security system she'd installed, complete with cameras, motion sensors, and those intimidating warning signs, had been done without the electrical permits required for exterior lighting modifications. The decorative fence surrounding her backyard exceeded the height restrictions outlined in both the city ordinance and our HOA covenants. Most damning of all, the home office addition where she conducted her HOA business had been built without proper permits, creating a structure that technically didn't exist according to city records. But tonight wasn't about building codes or permit violations. Tonight was about understanding how Veronica operated, how she gathered intelligence on her neighbors, and most importantly, how she stored the evidence she used to destroy people's lives. Because if 3 years of running a towing company had taught me anything, it was that corrupt officials always keep records. They just don't expect anyone to be clever enough to find them. The night vision binoculars revealed details that daylight surveillance couldn't capture. Veronica's home office, visible through a ground floor window, was lit by the blue glow of multiple computer monitors. File cabinets lined the walls like sentinels, and corkboards covered every available surface, creating what looked like a detective's incident room. But most interesting was the large table in the center of the room, covered with what appeared to be aerial photographs of the entire neighborhood. At 12:23 a.m., Veronica appeared at her office window, silhouetted against the monitor glow like a suburban Big Brother. She was still fully dressed despite the late hour, wearing one of her signature black pantsuits and holding what looked like a digital camera with a telephoto lens. For the next 15 minutes, I watched her methodically photograph something outside, and based on the angle of the camera, she was taking pictures of my house. You need to understand the level of obsession we're talking about here.
This woman was conducting round-the-clock surveillance operations on her own neighbors, documenting their activities with the dedication of a federal law enforcement agency. The camera equipment alone probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payments, and she was using it to wage psychological warfare against residents who had committed no greater sin than parking their legally owned vehicles in their own driveways. But here's where Veronica made her first critical mistake. She'd installed her security system incorrectly. The motion-activated floodlights were positioned to illuminate her yard, but they created perfect blind spots along the property line, where her fence met Mrs. Henderson's rose garden. Someone with basic knowledge of security systems, say someone who'd spent years coordinating with repo man and skip tracers, could easily identify the gaps in her coverage. At 12:45 a.m., I made my move. The timing had to be perfect. 3 seconds after the floodlights swept past the fence line, I slipped through the gap in the rose bushes and pressed myself against the side of Veronica's house. The vinyl siding was cold against my back as I edged toward the office window, my heart pounding loud enough that I was sure the neighbors 3 blocks away could hear it. The view through her office window was like looking into the command center of a military operation. The aerial photographs covering her desk weren't just random neighborhood shots. They were systematic surveillance images of every resident's property, annotated with handwritten notes about potential violations. I could see my own house circled in red ink, with measurements and timestamps, noting every time I'd moved my car, every visit from delivery trucks, even the day I'd pressure washed my driveway. But it was the file cabinets that made my blood run cold. Each drawer was labeled with a resident's address, and based on the thickness of some files, Veronica had been compiling intelligence on her neighbors for months. The Henderson file looked particularly thick, and I remembered the elderly woman's brave challenge at the community meeting. Clearly, Veronica didn't forget or forgive acts of defiance. The computer monitors displayed what appeared to be a database of violations, organized by address and resident name. Screenshots of Google Street View images were paired with current photographs, showing before and after comparisons of properties that highlighted even minor changes. Flower beds that had been expanded, mailboxes that had been replaced, even welcome mats that didn't meet her aesthetic standards. Everything was documented, categorized, and prepared for weaponization. Then I saw something that changed everything. Pinned to the corkboard directly above her desk was a document titled Priority Enforcement Targets, and my name was at the very top of the list. Below my address were detailed notes about my work schedule, my vehicle's daily movements, even observations about my grocery shopping patterns. She'd been studying me like a behavioral psychologist studies lab rats, looking for weaknesses and opportunities to strike. But here's where Veronica made her second critical mistake. She'd installed her security system incorrectly. The motion-activated floodlights were positioned to illuminate her yard, but they created perfect blind spots along the property line, where her fence met Mrs. Henderson's rose garden. Someone with basic knowledge of security systems, say someone who'd spent years coordinating with repo men and skip tracers, could easily identify the gaps in her coverage. At 12:45 a.m., I made my move. The timing had to be perfect. 3 seconds after the floodlights swept past the fence line, I slipped through the gap in the rose bushes and pressed myself against the side of Veronica's house. The vinyl siding was cold against my back as I edged toward the office window, my heart pounding loud enough that I was sure the neighbors 3 blocks away could hear it. The view through her office window was like looking into the command center of a military operation. The aerial photographs covering her desk weren't just random neighborhood shots. They were systematic surveillance images of every resident's property, annotated with handwritten notes about potential violations. I could see my own house circled in red ink, with measurements and timestamps, noting every time I'd moved my car, every visit from delivery trucks, even the day I'd pressure washed my driveway. But it was the file cabinets that made my blood run cold. Each drawer was labeled with a resident's address, and based on the thickness of some files, Veronica had been compiling intelligence on her neighbors for months. The Henderson file looked particularly thick, and I remembered the elderly woman's brave challenge at the community meeting. Clearly, Veronica didn't forget or forgive acts of defiance. The computer monitors displayed what appeared to be a database of violations, organized by address and resident name. Screenshots of Google Street View images were paired with current photographs, showing before and after comparisons of properties that highlighted even minor changes. Flower beds that had been expanded, mailboxes that had been replaced, even welcome mats that didn't meet her aesthetic standards. Everything was documented, categorized, and prepared for weaponization. Then I saw something that changed everything. Pinned to the corkboard directly above her desk was a document titled Priority Enforcement Targets, and my name was at the very top of the list. Below my address were detailed notes about my work schedule, my vehicle's daily movements, even observations about my grocery shopping patterns. She'd been studying me like a behavioral psychologist studies lab rats, looking for weaknesses and opportunities to strike. But here's where Veronica made her second critical mistake. She'd installed her security system incorrectly. The motion-activated floodlights were positioned to illuminate her yard, but they created perfect blind spots along the property line, where her fence met Mrs. Henderson's rose garden. Someone with basic knowledge of security systems, say someone who'd spent years coordinating with Repo Man and skip tracers, could easily identify the gaps in her coverage. At 12:45 a.m., I made my move. The timing had to be perfect. 3 seconds after the...
According to state HOA law, any resident can call an emergency board meeting if they present evidence of financial misconduct or abuse of fiduciary duty. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun as I stood at the head of the Willowbrook Estates conference table, watching the color drain from Veronica's face with the satisfaction of a hunter who'd finally cornered his prey. The manila folder in my hands contained 6 months of meticulously documented evidence, every forged signature, every fabricated violation report, every illegal towing authorization that had flowed through Rodriguez Recovery Services under her watch. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry hornets as board members shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, suddenly realizing they were about to witness either my spectacular destruction or Veronica's complete downfall. This wasn't just another HOA meeting. This was a reckoning 3 months in the making, and I was about to prove that sometimes the best revenge is simply letting someone's own corruption speak for itself. You're about to hear how 23 pieces of paper brought down a suburban dictator who thought she was untouchable. The emergency meeting had been called for 7 p.m. on a Thursday, exactly 72 hours after I'd submitted the required paperwork to the HOA management company. Under Nevada Revised Statutes, Chapter 116, any homeowner can force a special board meeting if they provide written notice of suspected financial irregularities or governance violations. Veronica had tried to block the meeting through her usual bureaucratic maneuvering, claiming my request lacked proper documentation, but state law was clear. Evidence of potential fraud trumped all procedural objections. The community center felt different that evening. Gone was the atmosphere of theatrical authority that Veronica had cultivated during her vehicle standards presentation. Tonight, the room crackled with nervous energy as residents filed in, drawn by whispered rumors that someone was finally challenging the HOA president's absolute power. Mrs. Henderson sat in the front row, her eyes bright with anticipation. The Chen family occupied the second row, probably hoping for vindication after months of harassment over their aesthetically inappropriate mailbox. Even residents who'd previously stayed neutral were present, sensing that tonight's meeting would determine the future of Willowbrook Estates. Veronica entered at exactly 7:03 p.m., flanked by her usual supporters, Janet Kowalski clutching her ever-present notebook, David Chen looking uncomfortable in his role as rubber stamp board member, and Treasurer Bob Martinez carrying a briefcase that probably contained nothing more threatening than his reading glasses. But Veronica's composure was different tonight. The confident stride had been replaced by careful, measured steps.
Her usual theatrical smile looked painted on, like a mask that didn't quite fit properly. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, my voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent months preparing for this moment, "thank you for attending tonight's emergency meeting. As the requesting resident, I'll be presenting evidence of systematic violations of our HOA's fiduciary responsibilities and possible criminal fraud." The words criminal fraud had the desired effect. Several board members visibly flinched, and I could see Veronica's jaw clench almost imperceptibly. The first document I placed on the table was a towing authorization dated 3 weeks earlier, signed by Veronica and addressed to Prestige Recovery Services, the name Rodriguez Recovery Services used for HOA contracts to maintain professional separation from my residential identity. The violation listed was excessive vehicle ornamentation, and the resident's signature appeared at the bottom, supposedly acknowledging the infraction. But here's what made this document fascinating. The resident in question was Harold Morrison, an 86-year-old widower who'd been in the hospital for pneumonia on the date he allegedly signed the acknowledgement. "Mr. Morrison," I said, addressing the elderly gentleman who sat near the back of the room, "could you please tell us where you were on October 15th? His voice was weak but clear as he explained his week-long hospital stay, producing discharge paperwork that proved he couldn't possibly have signed any HOA documents during that period. The room erupted in whispers as residents realized they were witnessing evidence of document forgery, a felony under Nevada state law. But that was just the appetizer. The second document was even more damning. A violation report for unauthorized automotive modifications filed against the Peterson family's Honda Civic. The report claimed their car's factory-installed roof rack violated community standards and included detailed photographs supposedly taken by a concerned resident. Except the photographs had been taken with the same camera equipment I'd observed in Veronica's home office during my midnight reconnaissance, and the metadata, which I'd had a computer forensics expert extract, showed they'd been captured from her bedroom window at 6:23 a.m. on a Sunday morning. "Mrs. Peterson," I continued, "were you aware that our HOA president was conducting surveillance photography of your property from her bedroom window?" Sarah Peterson stood up slowly, her face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "No one told us we were being watched like criminals," she said, her voice shaking. "We just thought someone had complained about the roof rack we use for camping gear." Document after document told the same story. The Williams family's excessive driveway ornamentation violation for a welcome mat Veronica personally deemed too colorful. The Jacksons' automotive mate on a Saturday afternoon. The Rodriguez, wait, that was me, violation for intimidating vehicle styling that had started this entire war. Each case followed the same pattern: manufactured violations, forged acknowledgments, and immediate towing authorizations that generated revenue for a company Veronica had no idea was owned by her primary target. Veronica finally found her voice as the evidence mounted against her. "This is highly irregular," she declared, standing up with the indignant authority of someone who'd never been challenged so publicly. "Mr. Rodriguez is clearly conducting a personal vendetta against the board's legitimate enforcement activities. These documents are taken out of context and—" "Actually," I interrupted, pulling out the most damning piece of evidence, "let's talk about context." The final document was Veronica's own handwritten notes, photocopied from pages I'd observed in her office during my surveillance operation. The notes detailed her enforcement strategy for increasing HOA revenue through proactive violation identification and rapid asset recovery procedures. Most incredibly, she'd written detailed profiles of residents she considered compliance resistance risks, essentially targeting lists of homeowners who might challenge her authority. The handwriting analysis had been conducted by a certified forensic examiner who'd confirmed the notes were written by the same person who'd signed all the towing authorizations. But it was the content that revealed the true scope of Veronica's operation. She'd been systematically targeting elderly residents, single-parent households, and anyone she perceived as financially vulnerable. The goal wasn't community standards.
It was revenue generation through manufactured violations and seized property. "This is outrageous," Veronica sputtered, her composure finally cracking under the weight of evidence. "You have no right to present stolen documents at an official HOA meeting. This is harassment, trespassing, probably criminal stalking." Nothing here was stolen, and everything was obtained through legitimate channels available to any homeowner conducting due diligence research. That wasn't entirely true, but the legal doctrine of fruit from the poisonous tree didn't apply to HOA governance disputes, and Veronica's own violations were far more serious than any procedural irregularities in my investigation methods. Board member David Chen, who had remained silent throughout the presentation, finally spoke up. "Veronica, some of these documents have your signature on them. Are you saying Mr. Rodriguez forged them?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and I could see Chen beginning to realize that his rubber-stamp loyalty might not protect him from criminal liability if this escalated to law enforcement involvement. But it was Treasurer Bob Martinez who asked the question that cut to the heart of the matter. "How much money are we talking about here? If these towing authorizations are all legitimate, there should be corresponding revenue in our accounts." He opened his briefcase and pulled out a financial ledger, his hands shaking slightly as he realized the implications of what he might discover. The silence that followed was deafening. Veronica's face had gone from pale to ashen, and her usual rapid-fire responses had been replaced by the kind of stammering that suggested someone was calculating legal exposure rather than crafting explanations. Because here's what she'd forgotten in her months of systematic exploitation. Every illegal towing fee, every fabricated fine, every dollar extracted from residents through fraudulent violations had created a paper trail that led directly back to the HOA's financial accounts. "The money," Martinez said slowly, scanning his ledger with growing alarm. "If these authorizations are fraudulent—" He looked up at Veronica with the expression of someone who just realized he might be an accessory to fraud. You could have heard a pin drop in that community center. 43 residents sat in stunned silence as the full scope of Veronica's operation became clear. This wasn't just about parking violations or community standards. It was systematic theft disguised as HOA enforcement. And every dollar stolen from her neighbors had been funneled through my own towing company, creating the perfect paper trail to document her crimes. But as I looked around the room at the shocked faces and righteous anger, I realized—
"I know who you are now, Marcus. I know what you've been doing." The red digital clock on my desk read 3:33 a.m. as Veronica's voice slivered through the phone speaker like a serpent, tasting the air before striking. Outside the office window of Rodriguez Recovery Services, her black Mercedes sat in my parking lot like a predator stalking its prey, headlights blazing through the industrial darkness of the warehouse district. The fluorescent security lights cast harsh shadows across the concrete, creating an atmosphere more suited to a film noir than a suburban HOA dispute. But this wasn't just Veronica making threatening phone calls anymore. This was a woman who'd discovered she'd been outplayed by her own game, and desperation had transformed her from neighborhood dictator into something far more dangerous. You're about to hear what happens when a suburban tyrant realizes she's been feeding evidence of her own crimes directly into the hands of her greatest enemy, and why her midnight confession would become the final nail in her own coffin. The emergency board meeting had ended 47 hours earlier, but clearly Veronica had spent every minute since then conducting damage control research. The evidence I'd presented had been overwhelming, but I'd made one critical miscalculation. I'd assumed she'd try to cover up her crimes rather than investigate mine. Instead, she'd done what any cornered predator does. She'd gone hunting for information that could be used as a weapon against her attacker. Rodriguez Recovery Services, she continued, her voice carrying the brittle satisfaction of someone who believed they'd uncovered a smoking gun. Established 3 years ago by Marcus Antonio Rodriguez of 47 Maple Grove Drive, Willowbrook Estates. Nevada business license number 2021-8847. The same Marcus Rodriguez who just happened to present detailed evidence of my illegal towing operations. I remained silent, partly because I was genuinely impressed by her investigative skills, and partly because I was curious to see how much she'd actually figured out. The phone system in my office was equipped with digital recording capability, a necessity in the towing business where disputes over fees and property damage were routine. But Veronica had no way of knowing that every word of her midnight confession was being captured in high-definition audio. "You set me up," she hissed, and I could hear the fury building in her voice like steam pressure in a boiler. "You've been collecting fees for towing cars that I authorized, then using those same transactions to frame me for fraud. It's entrapment, Marcus, criminal conspiracy. I'll have you arrested, sued, and bankrupted before—" "Actually," I interrupted calmly, "entrapment requires law enforcement inducement to commit crimes. I'm just a private citizen who happens to own the towing company you chose to do business with. If you committed fraud, that was your decision, not mine." The silence that followed was electric with rage. Through my office window, I could see her silhouette in the Mercedes, hunched over what looked like a laptop computer. She'd come prepared for this confrontation, armed with research and probably a detailed plan for my destruction. But here's what Veronica didn't understand about the towing business. We deal with desperate, angry people who make threats on a daily basis. Everything gets recorded, everything gets documented, and everything gets stored in case we need it later. "You think you're so smart," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow sounded more threatening than shouting. "But I've been playing this game longer than you've been alive. I know things about you now, Marcus, things that could destroy your business, your reputation, your entire life." Now I was curious. What could she possibly have discovered about my business operations that would constitute a threat? Rodriguez Recovery Services was scrupulously legal, properly licensed, and maintained detailed records of every transaction. I'd spent years building a reputation for honest dealing with law enforcement, insurance companies, and property managers, precisely to avoid the kind of complications that could arise from HOA disputes. "Enlighten me," I said, settling back in my desk chair and checking to make sure the recording system was functioning properly. "Your contract with Willowbrook Estates was signed under false pretenses," she declared with the triumphant tone of someone who believed they'd found the perfect counterattack. "You failed to disclose your residency in the community when you bid for the towing services contract. That's a conflict of interest, probably criminal fraud, and definitely grounds for voiding every transaction we've ever conducted." I had to give her credit for creativity, but her legal theory had more holes than a screen door. Nevada business law doesn't require disclosure of residency for service contracts unless there's a specific conflict of interest clause in the agreement. I'd reviewed our HOA contract thoroughly before signing it, and there was no such provision. More importantly, the contract had been signed with the previous board president, not with Veronica's administration. "Interesting theory," I replied, "but you might want to check the contract dates. I signed that agreement 18 months before you became board president and 2 years before I moved to Willowbrook Estates. There was no residency conflict because I wasn't a resident when the contract was executed." Another silence, shorter this time, but filled with the kind of frustrated energy that suggested she was rapidly recalculating her attack strategy. Through the window, I could see her typing frantically on the laptop computer, probably researching contract law or looking for alternative angles of attack. "It doesn't matter," she said finally, her voice taking on the desperate edge of someone whose primary weapon had just been neutralized. "I know people, Marcus, people with influence, people who can make your business disappear with a few phone calls. The mayor's office, the city licensing board, the Better Business Bureau, they all listen to me when I have concerns about local businesses." And there it was, the explicit threat to use her political connections to destroy my livelihood. This wasn't just about HOA violations anymore. This was extortion, and she was stupid enough to make the threat over a recorded phone line. You need to understand something about people like Veronica. They're so accustomed to wielding power without consequences that they forget other people might be prepared for their tactics. You're saying that you're going to use your political connections to retaliate against someone who exposed your fraud, I said carefully, making sure my words were clear for the recording. Are you saying you plan to use your influence with city officials to harm my business because I presented evidence of your illegal activities to the HOA board? I'm saying, she replied, her voice now cold and calculating, that people who attack me tend to discover that their lives become very complicated very quickly. Business licenses get reviewed more carefully, insurance claims get scrutinized more closely, tax filings receive extra attention from the authorities. Each threat was more specific than the last, and each one was being permanently recorded for future reference. But what made this conversation truly surreal was watching her through the office window as she spoke. She'd positioned her Mercedes so the headlights illuminated my building like a spotlight, creating a dramatic tableau that she probably thought was intimidating. Instead, it looked like amateur theater, a middle-aged woman in a luxury car making midnight threats like some kind of suburban crime boss. Here's what's going to happen, she continued, apparently emboldened by what she interpreted as my silence. You're going to withdraw your allegations about the towing authorizations. You're going to issue a public apology to the board for your misunderstanding of HOA procedures, and you're going to resign from the community rather than force me to escalate this dispute to levels you won't survive. The ultimatum hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. This was Veronica's final offer, delivered with the confidence of someone who believed they held all the cards. But what she couldn't see from her parking lot surveillance position was the wall of my office covered with certificates from the Nevada Towing Association, commendations from local law enforcement agencies, and business licenses that represented 3 years of building exactly the kind of reputation she was now threatening to destroy. "And if I refuse your generous offer?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Then you'll learn what happens when you declare war on someone who actually knows how to fight." Her voice carried the finality of someone delivering a death sentence. "I have resources you can't imagine, Marcus. I have connections that go back decades in this city. By the time I'm finished with you, Rodriguez Recovery Services will be a cautionary tale that other contractors tell about what happens when you cross the wrong person." The Mercedes engine revved once, twice, like an exclamation point punctuating her threats. Then the headlights went dark, and I heard the distinctive sound of expensive German engineering pulling away from my parking lot. But the phone line remained open, and I could hear her breathing as she drove away, probably expecting me to beg for mercy or negotiate some kind of surrender. Instead, I reached over and pressed the stop button on the recording system, then immediately copied the digital file to 3 separate backup drives. 47 minutes of crystal-clear audio capturing Veronica Ashworth making explicit threats to abuse her political connections. Load 'em up, boys. Every single violation on the list. The yellow warning lights of 17 tow trucks painted the dawn sky like a constellation of justice as my crew spread throughout Willowbrook Estates with military precision at 6:15 a.m. on a Saturday morning. Steam rose from coffee cups and kitchen windows as residents stumbled from their beds to witness the largest coordinated towing operation in suburban Nevada history. Tommy Martinez's voice crackled through my radio headset as he confirmed the first target secured, Veronica Ashworth's pristine black Mercedes, hooked up and ready for transport under the exact same excessive chrome detailing violation she'd used against my BMW 3 weeks earlier. The irony was so perfect it felt orchestrated by the universe itself. After months of terrorizing her neighbors through weaponized HOA regulations, Veronica was about to learn that every rule she'd twisted into a weapon could be turned against her. You're about to witness the most spectacular reversal of suburban power in HOA history, where 17 years of towing expertise met months of documented tyranny in a ballet of mechanical revenge that would be talked about for decades. The operation had been planned with the meticulous precision of a military campaign. Every vehicle targeted for removal had been documented, photographed, and cross-referenced against the Vehicle Standards Initiative that Veronica herself had championed just weeks earlier. The beauty of her own system was its comprehensive absurdity. She'd created regulations so restrictive and subjectively interpreted that virtually every car in the neighborhood could be found in violation of something. Chrome trim exceeded community standards. Tinted windows violated transparency policies. Roof racks constituted unauthorized modifications, and even factory paint colors could be deemed aesthetically incompatible with neighborhood harmony. But here's what made this morning's operation legally bulletproof. I was enforcing the exact same rules Veronica had used against other residents, using the same authorization procedures she'd established, and following the same documentation requirements she'd demanded. Every towing order was signed by the board president, technically still Veronica, though that would change within hours. And every violation was supported by photographic evidence using her own surveillance methodology. The first truck entered the neighborhood at precisely 6 a.m., the earliest time allowed under municipal noise ordinances. Tommy's flatbed rumbled down Maple Grove Drive like a mechanical predator, yellow strobes flashing in the pre-dawn darkness. Behind him came Maria Santos in the heavy-duty wrecker, followed by a convoy of specialized towing equipment that represented 3 years of business growth and strategic investment. Each driver carried a clipboard with specific targets, violation codes, and photographic evidence that would have impressed a federal prosecutor. Veronica's Mercedes was target number 1, parked in her driveway like a monument to suburban superiority. The violation report I'd filed 3 days earlier cited excessive reflective surfaces creating visual pollution, non-regulation tire sidewall height, and my personal favorite, intimidating vehicle styling inconsistent with family-friendly community values. Every single charge was lifted verbatim from violations she'd filed against other residents, including the creative interpretation of factory chrome trim as a community standards violation. Tommy worked with practiced efficiency, backing his flatbed up to the Mercedes with the kind of precision that comes from years of repo work in tight spaces. The hydraulic whine of the lifting mechanism cut through the morning silence like a metallic shriek, accompanied by the rhythmic beeping of the truck's backup alarm. Within minutes, Veronica's pride and joy was secured to the flatbed, its expensive German engineering reduced to just another piece of impounded property. That's when Veronica appeared. She burst from her front door at 6:23 a.m. in a silk robe and fuzzy slippers, her usually perfect hair wild from sleep and her face a mask of absolute fury. "Stop! Stop right now!" she shrieked, running barefoot across her manicured lawn toward Tommy's truck. "You can't take my car! I'm the board president! I authorize these procedures!" Tommy looked up from his clipboard with the professional courtesy of someone who dealt with hundreds of angry car owners. "Ma'am, I have a properly executed towing authorization signed by the board president. The authorization is valid, the violations are documented, and the procedures have been followed according to your own established protocols." The confusion on Veronica's face was priceless as she tried to process what he'd said. She was the board president who authorized the towing, but she was also the vehicle owner whose car was being impounded. The cognitive dissonance of being trapped by her own bureaucratic machinery was beautiful to witness. "I didn't authorize towing my own car," she screamed, clutching her robe closed against the morning chill. "This is impossible. Show me the paperwork." Tommy handed her the violation report with the patience of someone following standard operating procedures. As she read her own signature authorizing the impoundment of her own vehicle, her face went through a spectrum of emotions that ranged from confusion to fury to something approaching panic. Because the paperwork was legitimate, filed through the system she'd created, using the same violation categories she'd established, and bearing the same presidential signature she'd used to destroy her neighbors' lives. But Veronica's Mercedes was just the beginning. While she stood in her driveway screaming at Tommy, 16 other trucks were systematically working their way through the neighborhood, targeting every vehicle belonging to her supporters, board members, and enablers. Janet Kowalski's Honda Civic, violation. Inappropriate color choice undermining community aesthetic standards. David Chen's pickup truck, violation. Commercial vehicle appearance incompatible with residential zoning. Bob Martinez's SUV, violation, excessive height creating visual obstruction for neighboring properties. Each target had been carefully selected based on months of observation and documentation. These weren't random residents caught up in Veronica's power games. These were the people who'd enabled her tyranny, voted for her policies, and turned blind eyes to her abuse of authority. They'd profited from the system she'd created, collecting higher property values while their neighbors suffered under her manufactured violations. Now they were discovering that the same system could devour them just as efficiently as it had consumed everyone else. The neighborhood erupted into chaos as residents emerged to find their driveways empty and their cars disappearing onto flatbeds. Mrs. Henderson watched from her porch with obvious satisfaction as Janet Kowalski's car was loaded up, probably remembering how Janet had voted to approve every one of Veronica's ridiculous policies. The Chen family, not board member David Chen, but their elderly parents who'd been harassed over their mailbox, stood in their yard taking photographs of David's truck being impounded for the same aesthetic violations he'd used to justify towing their neighbors' cars. You should have seen the panic spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Board supporters who'd spent months nodding along with Veronica's enforcement campaigns suddenly found themselves on the wrong end of the very system they'd helped create. Phone calls flew between houses as people tried to understand what was happening and why their cars were being taken. But the beautiful truth was that every towing was completely legal under the rules they'd all voted to approve. Veronica tried to rally her supporters, running from house to house in her robe and slippers, like a suburban Paul Revere warning of approaching disaster. But her credibility was somewhat undermined by the fact that her own Mercedes was already disappearing down Maple Grove Drive, and her frantic explanations about illegal procedures and unauthorized actions fell flat when confronted with documentation bearing her own signature. The operation concluded at 8:47 a.m., with 17 vehicles impounded and 17 families discovering that the HOA enforcement system they'd supported worked exactly as designed, ruthlessly, arbitrarily, and without regard for the personal convenience of its victims. The only difference was that this time the victims were the very people who'd created and enabled the system in the first place. As the last tow truck pulled away from Willowbrook Estates, I stood in my driveway watching the aftermath of perfectly executed suburban warfare. Veronica stood in her empty driveway, still in her robe, clutching violation reports that proved she'd authorized the impoundment of her own vehicle. Her supporters gathered in confused clusters, trying to comprehend how their cars had been legally stolen using their own rules and procedures. But the most satisfying moment came when,
Ladies and gentlemen, by the powers granted to me under Nevada Revised Statutes, Chapter 116, I hereby call for a vote of no confidence in the current board president. The words echoed through the packed Willowbrook Estates Community Center like a judge's gavel delivering a death sentence, and you could have heard a pin drop in the silence that followed. Standing room only didn't begin to describe the crowd that had gathered for what would go down as the most dramatic HOA meeting in suburban Nevada history. News vans from KLAS-TV, Fox 5, and News 3 lined the parking lot, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metallic flowers blooming in the desert of suburban justice. Social media had transformed our quiet neighborhood dispute into a viral phenomenon, with hashtags like HOA Revenge and Towing Wars trending across 3 states. Veronica Ashworth sat at the head table like Napoleon at Waterloo, her empire crumbling around her as residents she'd terrorized for months now stared at her with the hungry anticipation of spectators at a public execution. The thick manila folder in front of me contained enough evidence to end not just her HOA presidency, but quite possibly her career, her reputation, and her freedom. Where are you watching from right now? Because you're about to witness the most satisfying downfall of a suburban dictator ever captured on camera. The meeting had been called under emergency procedures after 17 residents filed simultaneous complaints alleging fraud, abuse of power, and criminal conspiracy in the wake of Saturday morning's mass towing operation. But what had started as a neighborhood revenge plot had exploded into something much larger when local news stations picked up the story of the HOA president who had accidentally authorized the towing of her own car. The absurdity of the situation had captured public imagination, turning Veronica into the poster child for HOA overreach and suburban tyranny. Channel 8's investigative team had spent the past 3 days digging into Veronica's background, and what they'd discovered would have impressed a forensic accountant. Her previous HOA in Henderson had filed complaints with the Nevada Real Estate Division about her aggressive enforcement tactics. The property management company she'd worked for in Las Vegas had quietly let her go after allegations of kickback schemes with preferred contractors. Most damaging of all, public records showed a pattern of HOA disputes following her wherever she moved, like a trail of bureaucratic destruction across the Las Vegas Valley. But tonight wasn't about her past. It was about the mountain of evidence I'd compiled over the past 4 months, documenting every illegal towing authorization, every forged signature, every fabricated violation that had generated revenue for Rodriguez Recovery Services. The beauty of owning the towing company she'd been using was that I had perfect documentation of every crime she'd committed, time-stamped and signed by her own hand. The community center buzzed with nervous energy as residents filed in, many clutching smartphones to record what promised to be a historic confrontation. Mrs. Henderson sat in the front row, her eyes bright with anticipation after months of suffering under Veronica's reign. The Chen family occupied the second row, probably savoring the irony that their persecutor was about to face the same kind of bureaucratic destruction she'd inflicted on them. Even residents who'd previously remained neutral were present, drawn by the promise of witnessing justice served with a side of poetic irony. Veronica entered at 7:17 p.m., flanked by what remained of her support network, though notably absent were board members Janet Kowalski and David Chen, whose cars were still impounded and whose loyalty had evaporated along with their transportation. She looked diminished somehow, her usual authoritative stride replaced by the careful steps of someone walking through a minefield. The black pantsuit that had once projected power now seemed like funeral attire, appropriate for someone attending the burial of their own political career. Before we addressed tonight's agenda, I began, standing to address the packed room. I want to establish the legal foundation for what we were about to discuss. Under Nevada Revised Statutes, Section 116.31036, residents have the right to remove board members for gross negligence, breach of fiduciary duty, or criminal conduct. Tonight, we'll be examining evidence that suggests all three conditions have been met. The cameras rolled as I opened my manila folder and withdrew the first document, a photocopy of Veronica's handwritten notes detailing her revenue enhancement strategy through aggressive towing enforcement. The notes, obtained during my midnight surveillance operation, laid out her plan to target elderly residents and single-parent households for maximum compliance extraction. The clinical language she'd used to describe the systematic exploitation of her neighbors was chilling in its bureaucratic precision. "These are President Ashworth's personal notes," I continued, holding up the documents for the cameras, outlining what she called priority enforcement targets, essentially a hit list of residents she considered vulnerable to financial extortion through manufactured HOA violations. Veronica's face went ashen as she recognized her own handwriting being displayed to a room full of angry residents and rolling news cameras. But she maintained her composure with the skill of someone who'd spent a career managing hostile corporate boardrooms. "Those documents were obtained illegally," she declared, standing up as much authority as she could muster. "Mr. Rodriguez is guilty of trespassing, stalking, and theft of private property. Everything he's presenting tonight is the fruit of criminal conduct and should be excluded from consideration." The legal objection was actually valid, but HOA governance hearings operate under different rules than criminal courts. More importantly, I had plenty of evidence that had been obtained through completely legitimate channels, like the 47 minutes of recorded threats she'd made during her midnight visit to my tow yard. "Actually," I replied, reaching for my laptop, "let's listen to some evidence that was obtained through perfectly legal means." The speakers crackled to life as Veronica's voice filled the community center, crystal clear and unmistakably threatening. "I know people, Marcus. People with influence. People who can make your business disappear with a few phone calls." The effect on the crowd was electric. Gasps rippled through the packed room as residents heard their HOA president explicitly threatening to abuse her political connections to destroy a business owner who'd exposed her fraud. But the recording continued, capturing increasingly specific threats about tax audits, license reviews, and regulatory harassment, each threat another nail in the coffin of her credibility and quite possibly her freedom. "That recording," she stammered, her composure finally cracking under the weight of evidence, "was made without my knowledge or consent. It's illegal wiretapping under Nevada law." Nevada is a one-party consent state. I was legally entitled to record our conversation since I was a participant. But more importantly, you just admitted on camera that the voice on this recording is yours, which means you've just confirmed the authenticity of evidence showing you threatening to abuse your political connections for personal revenge. The crowd erupted in angry murmurs as the full scope of Veronica's corruption became clear. This wasn't just about parking violations or community standards. It was about a systematic campaign to extract money from residents through fraudulent enforcement actions, backed by threats of political retaliation against anyone who dared to resist. But the final blow came when I presented the financial records showing exactly how much money had been funneled through the fraudulent towing operations. Rodriguez Recovery Services had processed $47,000 in HOA towing fees over the past 6 months. Every dollar generated through violations that either were fabricated or based on rules that didn't exist in the community's governing documents. $47,000, I announced, letting the number hang in the air like an accusation. That's how much President Ashworth has extracted from this community through illegal towing operations. Money taken from your neighbors for violations of rules she made up, authorized through signatures she forged and enforced through threats of political retaliation. Treasurer Bob Martinez, who had somehow avoided having his car towed and was still technically a board member, stood up with shaking hands. As treasurer, I can confirm that these towing fees have been processed through our community accounts. If the underlying violations were fraudulent, then his voice trailed off as the implications became clear. The HOA's financial records now contained evidence of systematic fraud, implicating not just Veronica, but potentially the entire board in a criminal conspiracy. The vote, when it finally came, was a foregone conclusion. 43 residents voted to remove Veronica from her position as board president, with only 2 abstentions and 0 votes in support. But the real victory wasn't the parliamentary procedure. It was watching Veronica's face as she realized that her empire of suburban tyranny had collapsed completely, brought down by the same meticulous documentation